I will now introduce the strange phenomenon of the vav consecutive, lesson 18 in Ross. So far we've talked about the perfect, which is completed action, usually past, and the imperfect, which is incomplete action, which is usually future. But in the Hebrew narrative, it will do a rather strange thing in which the form which is normally translated future ends up being translated as past, and the form which is usually past can end up being translated future. And this is known as the vav consecutive. Now, he begins by telling you that in the Hebrew Bible, past time narrative normally employs a verb in the prefix congregation, or the imperfect, and a special form of the vav conjunctive to continue the narrative. So he gives you the example here, Shema Adonai Otam Ve'yizkor Brito. The Lord heard them, and he remembered his covenant. Now, the strange thing is this verb here, sakar. And what you have a vav with a patah, with a doubling of the yod that follows, which is not what vavs usually do, and then a verb in the imperfect. And under those circumstances where you have this vav with a patah, usually doubling the yod that follows, and a verb in the imperfect, this will be a vav consecutive, as it's called, in which case the imperfect verb is going to be translated as if it were a perfect. Notice that you begin with a verb in the perfect, Shema, the Lord heard, and that gives you the context to indicate that this verb must also be understood as in the past. Now, as Ross notes, this special form of the imperfect may actually not be an imperfect. Scholars have proposed that it's actually a different verbal system, a preterite form of sorts. But regardless of whether or not that's true, as far as the reader is concerned, it looks like an imperfect, even though you translate it as if it were a perfect. And that's why older grammar sometimes called it vav conversive. It's as if you were converting the imperfect into a perfect. Though, again, strictly grammatically, it's probably a different verbal tense than the imperfect. So anyway, when you do that, well, this is what it would look like. So here you have the paradigm of the pakad in the imperfect. And so, again, vayikod would mean, and he chose, as if it were vepakad with a verb in the perfect. And on down the list, you're adding the vav, you add the patah, and then you double the consonant that follows. You can't do that with the aleph, so instead of doubling the aleph on the first common singular form, f-code, you end up with a compensatory lengthening of the kamat from patah to kamats in this case. But in each case, it would be and he chose, and she chose, and you chose, on down the list to and we chose. The typical narrative sequence will be to start with, say, a verb in the perfect, and then continue your narrations with verbs in the Vav consecutive imperfects. So here it says halak vayilkod otah velo Shabbat. And here you have he went, and then you have a Vav consecutive form, and he captured. So even though the verb is imperfect because of the Vav and the doubling, you're going to translate it as a past tense. And he captured Otah, her, or it, if it happens to be a city. Ve and lo Shabbat. Now, when you have a negation, you cannot negate a Vav consecutive verb. So you have to go back to a verb in the perfect. And he did not cease or did not rest. So he went and he captured it, and he did not rest. Here you have a verb in the perfect. Here you have a Vav consecutive plus a Cal imperfect third masculine singular, third masculine singular. But then you go back to a Cal perfect third masculine singular. That's the typical kind of pattern. Now, Ross suggests that you not call it a imperfect, call it a preterite in order to distinguish it from the imperfect. And if you want to go ahead and follow his convention, that's fine. Although if you want to say that it's a Vav consecutive plus an imperfect, it would be the same thing. But this is on the assumption that the theory of a separate preterite form is correct, and there is a good case for that interpretation. So if you have a form like this, yiktov, you would parse that as which means he will write, or he may write, or may he write, or he could write, or should write, or ought to write, or any of those meanings. But anyway, that would be simply a Cal imperfect third masculine singular. But if you have Vayiktov, that would be a preterite third masculine singular plus a Vav consecutive. And since the Vav consecutive comes first, I'd probably say a Vav consecutive plus a preterite third masculine singular. But if you call it an imperfect rather than a preterite, I don't really care personally. But in any case, it's the same effect. It means that it's going to be translated as a past tense. Now, when you have a Vav consecutive with a preterite or an imperfect, the accent will sometimes shift for certain types of verbs. For example, with third hey verbs like bana, he built, the imperfect would be yivneh, he will build. But when you make it Vav consecutive, it becomes vayiven. A couple of things happen. One, you lose your hey, along with the vowel that goes with it. And then what's left is treated kind of like a sigilate, where the accent recedes, and you get vayiven as the form there. Now, usually you start off with a verb in the perfect, and then subsequent verbs in the narrative are in the Vav consecutive. But you can also begin a narrative discussion with a verb in the Vav consecutive. And so here you have Vayil kod oto, Vayisrof oto. Literally, and he captured it. Again, even though it's imperfect looking, you're translating it past because it's Vav consecutive. And he burned it. Now, to English ears, all these ands kind of sound a little redundant. And so translating it is, especially when you begin with an and, is somewhat optional. So if you wanted to ignore the vav and just say he captured it and burned it, that would be fine. And indeed, in this case, the vav is giving you kind of a circumstantial clause, in which case what it could mean, and what it probably does mean, is when he captured it, he burned it, in which case you don't translate either one of the vavs. So anyway, that's when you begin with a vav consecutive, a narrative section, a lot of translations will simply omit it. And Ross points out that you can actually change subjects in this kind of sequence. So here you have Yashav, he sat down, by Yid Reish Ha'am Oto, and the people sought him. And so you have a different grammatical subject for Yashav than for the verb to seek. The king sat down, or the judge, whoever he is, but then the people sought him. Section 18.3, Future Time Narrative and Prophetic Sequence. It turns out that once this vav consecutive plus an imperfect looking verb was established, and the predicate form, other than in the vav consecutive, had pretty much died out, it looked like you were taking an imperfect and converting it into a perfect meaning. And by analogy, they began doing it the opposite direction with verbs in the perfect. So you could start a narrative sequence with a imperfect conveying future. Yisrafu, they will burn et ha'ir, the city. Ve and lakadu et ha'am, and they will capture the people. They will burn the city and they will capture the people. Now this is a imperfect, no vav is attached to it, so it needs to be imperfect in meaning some sort of incomplete action. It could mean they wish to burn the city rather than they will. I mean, you have all those modal usages as well as the future sort of meaning of imperfect. But whatever the meaning, it has to be imperfect. But then in this sequence, this phrase in the vav plus a verb in the perfect is going to be interpreted as if it were a imperfect. They will burn the city and they will capture the people. And so you would parse this as a perfect plus a vav consecutive in order to distinguish it from the regular perfect. And it's called perfect tense because the construction seems to have developed as a alternative syntactical function of the perfect tense. Again, by analogy with the imperfect looking forms that were converted by a vav, so the perfects get converted as well. Now, unlike the vav consecutives with the imperfect, there is no special form of vav here, and very often you can't tell the difference between a form like ve katav as to whether it means and he wrote or and he will write. The main thing that will tip your hand on that is if you have preceding this verb a verb in the imperfect that sets the time sequence. But we'll continue this on the next video.